Whenever we study the Bible, we want to get the most meaning out of it that we can. Allegorical interpretation is one of the tools we can use to do that. Today we'll explore allegory in the wonderful Megillat Esther, the biblical story behind the holiday of Purim. The basic question is, what's it all about? What's it trying to tell us? But there are some other interesting questions to ask about the book and about the holiday that celebrates it. The historical context will help us understand the allegory, and the allegory will help us understand much more. But first, let's take a look at the whole idea of allegory. What does that mean? An allegory is a story that is about one thing, but is really about something else. In other words, everything in the story represents something outside of the story, something larger and more important than the story itself. To understand an allegory, we start with the characters, and we try to see what they represent. Then we consider the themes of the story, and with characters and themes in place, you can get a sense of what the allegory is trying to say. We can think about this, that an allegory is like a capsule. We put medicine in a capsule so that we can swallow it, but we don't want the capsule, we want the medicine that's inside of it. An allegory is a capsule that delivers some wisdom. And part of our job is to open up that capsule and understand the wisdom that's inside of it. It's always good to start with Chazal, our sages of blessed memory. There are many traditional interpretations. This is a much commented on book. And there is a consensus that Esther is an allegory. There are countless variations and nuances, but at least one common thread is that the king represents God and Esther represents Am Yisrael. I agree that seeing Esther as Am Yisrael makes a lot of sense. I'm not so sure about the king. It's understandable. There are thousands of midrashim in which a king stands for God. But this king, he's not exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. I'm going to propose a different view. I'm suggesting that God is definitely represented in the story, not by the king, but by Mordechai. Esther is Am Yisrael, and if the king is not God, who is he? I'm proposing that the king and Haman stand for two archetypal kinds of non-Jews, the redeemable and the unredeemable. These are powerful and important ideas, and we'll explore them further shortly. Given these characters, the theme of Esther is Jews, God, and history, that is, the history and destiny of all people. So, yeah, it's very big. I see Esther as a very small and a very big book. If I'm correct that the theme of Esther is Jews, God, and history, I think it's important to review the Jewish perspective on this subject as expressed in Torah, Tanakh, and thousands of years of Jewish tradition. Basically, there's a God and there are humans trying to work out the relationships, first between God and people, also between people and people. It's complicated and it's challenging for both. The Jewish view is that history is a series of eras that has a definite direction. It started in Eden. It went through a lot. The birth of Abraham was a turning point. beginning the era of Israel, where we are now, which is supposed to bring us to the Messianic age, which, according to the New York Times this morning, has not yet arrived. Since part of this is future, how can I call it history? We have prophets who tell us what's going to happen. So this is a Jewish view of all history, including the past, as recorded in our tradition, and the future, as foreseen by our prophets. Naturally, a lot of the Jewish tradition is about Israel, so let's dive into that and explore its subphases. Here we see them, the patriarchs, the slavery in Egypt, the turning point of the Exodus, the time in the wilderness, the time of the kingdom in the promised land, and then the time of the diaspora. Notice, looking at the bottom, that the Torah covers everything up to the entry in the promised land, and the rest of Tanakh, the prophets and the writings, mostly cover the time of the kingdom. The writings give us history. The prophets tell us how God saw it, because most of the prophets were alive and speaking in the time of the kingdom. We know about diaspora in two ways, because prophets in the kingdom predicted it, and because there were a couple of prophets and a couple of writings during the diaspora. Not a lot. And perhaps the most notable of biblical diaspora writings is the book of Esther. In its setting and when it was written, Babylon has already conquered Judea. We are in exile. Persia has taken over as the dominant power, and a great Persian emperor has allowed some Jews to return to Israel, which is the beginning of the Second Temple. But some of the Jews remain in the diaspora, and that is the focus of Esther. And Jewish particularism, the idea that the Jews have a special relationship with God and a special divine mission in history, is alive and well at this time, and certainly in this story. A lot has been said and written on this. I think a lot depends on how you take it. If we don't use the idea to justify arrogance, but instead see it as a responsibility to be of service to God and to all people, then perhaps it's not the worst idea we've ever had. Some modern Jewish thinkers have questioned it deeply or rejected it entirely, but regardless of what we think of it today, we can't understand this story, and indeed much of our Jewish tradition, without understanding this idea. The diaspora is a new situation with new needs that our Bible had to address. We're not in our own kingdom. We're immigrants, strangers in lands that are strange to us. Our relationship with God is different. Malachi was the last prophet some years ago, and we don't have obvious miracles going on like manna, seas parting, and so on. Sometimes we say that God is hidden. In diaspora, we have a new challenge. We have to assimilate enough to survive, but we have to maintain our Jewish identity. We also have to deal with new kinds of dangers, not other nations coming to attack our nation, but the kind of anti-immigration sentiment that just seems to keep popping up. And with all that, we have to keep faith and hope alive, because without faith and hope, what do we have? What does anyone have? And beyond that, we have to do tikkun olam. We have to do whatever we can to help make the world better. That's quite a situation. I think that Esther was written as a guidebook to life in the diaspora. And if these descriptions sound familiar, it's because they apply just as much today as they did at that time. We are still in the diaspora. We needed this book then, and we need it now. Esther is our book. I want to elaborate a little on this idea of God being hidden. Let's look at the history of God's presence in the Jewish Bible. Most of the time, God was there in very tangible ways. In Eden, he was walking and talking with the humans. In the pre- and post-flood times, he was talking with a few and intervening dramatically, as we see in the story of the Tower of Babel, and even more in the flood. In the time of the patriarchs, God was speaking quite directly to some of them, and there were also dreams, signs, and wonders of God's making. In the time of slavery in Egypt, perhaps we had a preview of a hidden God, but we know that God was there listening, and we understand from the Exodus that there was a purpose to that. And certainly in the Exodus and after, God was talking to Moses, doing miracles. He revealed the Torah. He was providing his presence in various ways. And in the kingdom, we had a lot. We had prophecy, direct messages from God. We had the temple and the priests. And we also had the land, the fulfillment of the promise. Basically, in the diaspora, all of this goes away. You may not think that God is literally hidden. I don't want to be controversial about that. But in the light of these points, the idea of the hidden God is something we can understand. We've covered a lot of important background, and now we're ready to interpret the allegory. Let's start with the name of the book. It's not the scroll of Mordechai or the scroll of Achashverosh or Shushan. It's the scroll of Esther. In Persian, Esther means star. If you took out the you have stir, which is close to star. I'm sure there's an etymological connection. In Hebrew, the word Esther is related to a verb that means to hide. The Hebrew word here appears with these exact letters, sometimes with a v and at the front. It appears 5 times in the Tanakh to mean hiding, and many other times in different forms. It occurs twice in the prophet Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is actually talking about the fact that God will be hiding in the diaspora. And Ezekiel's time was probably just 100 years before the time of the book of Esther. So people then were very likely aware of Ezekiel. So I think a lot of it is right there in the name of the book. Esther, the story of a great Jewish star, and a reference to our destiny to be a light unto the nations. And Esther, the story of the hidden God, which is the story of the diaspora. Putting these together, Esther is the story of Am Yisrael in the diaspora. There it is. It's often been observed that the name of God does not appear in the book. We can start with the allegorical meaning of that. The absence of God's name suggests that to maintain faith and hope in the diaspora, we have to live with a God who's hidden and to sense his sometimes invisible, behind-the-scenes workings in the world, as we see in Esther. Those are the basics, and now let's explore some of the details and see how this allegory works out. We are just going to cover a few points. If you study the book, think about how this allegory might work in other parts of the story. For now, let's start with this idea that Mordechai and Esther represent God and Am Yisrael. Mordechai adopts Esther, he protects her, and he guides her. This is what God does with Israel. And Mordechai and Esther are partners in the redemption theme. This reflects a key Jewish idea that God and Israel are partners in the redemption of the world. God, Mordechai, sets up the situation and gives advice to Esther. Esther's faith can waver, but she does come through, and she adds some tricks of her own devising. All of this, I think, works very well with the allegorical interpretation and the traditional idea of partnership between God and people. I said that the king and Haman represent the two primary archetypes of non-Jews, and I described them as redeemable and unredeemable. I think this is pretty close to the Jewish view. Our view is optimistic, that most people can be brought into the light. The prophetic vision of the Messianic age is one where all people understand God and our relationship with God. But there is a sense in Judaism that some people are just never going to understand, and it's not going to work out for them. In the Torah, that's called a melech. So here's the king. He's materialistic, he's a bit dim, very easily influenced for bad or for good. But he does have a sense of gratitude and justice. When he finds out that Mordechai saved his life, he feels grateful. He feels that something should be done for Mordechai. And most important, the king can recognize beauty in Israel and fall in love with it. And that's what the storyline between the king and Esther represents. And the king can make some good choices in the clutch. Redeemable. Haman, on the other hand, is totally materialistic. He lives for wealth and power. He's smart, but he's the implacable foe of Israel and of God, because he's incapable of accepting a higher power. Haman thinks that might makes right. In that sense, Haman represents Amalek, and the story tells us that Haman is a descendant of King Agag, who is the head of the Amalek people. So this is really very clear. Many plot points support the idea that Mordechai represents God. Mordechai keeps the king alive. Well, God is keeping all of us alive. Mordechai recognizes Haman's true character, and he won't surrender to Haman, even though everyone in the world does. That's God's nature. God is God. He is the superior power, even if every person fails to recognize it. Mordechai foresees and invisibly organizes Haman's doom. There's this whole question of why Mordechai does not bow down to Haman in the story. It can't be because Jews don't bow down to people, because they do. One of the best answers is that it was a deliberate provocation, that Mordechai knew it would bring Haman down. That might be very godlike, especially in the diaspora. The whole story reflects one of God's first promises to Abraham. Those who bless you will be blessed. Those who curse you will be cursed. Clearly, Megillat Esther is a story of the fulfillment of that promise. Faith in that promise explains how Mordechai can bear to send his beloved Esther into the court of the king. and how God can bear to send his beloved Am Yisrael into the diaspora. Let's consider some key turning points that work allegorically. The king falling in love with Esther and choosing her as his queen. The king recognizing his debt to Mordechai for his very life. Esther convincing the king that if he loves her, he has to make a choice. The king making that choice and ending up with it all, love with Esther, and a kingdom that's capably managed by Mordechai. Can you see how all of these points work in the allegory I'm suggesting? So I think you can see Esther as a kind of Jewish book of revelations. Allegorically, Esther accomplishes its mission with a lot of help from God. Its mission of turning the nations away from the false god of wealth and power to the real God, of finally defeating Amalek, and of bringing about the Messianic age. Allegorically, the triumph at the end of the book is not just one historical event, but the ultimate triumph of redemption. Esther shows us that the diaspora is a necessary part of God's plan because it disperses the Jews throughout the world so they can be a positive influence for all people. And I think that's the main way that the book of Esther provides faith and hope in the diaspora. Diaspora can be pretty discouraging, to say the least. But if we can see it as something that's meant to be for a greater good, and if we can feel that although God may be hidden, he is working invisibly to bring it all about, and that however bad it looks at times, a reversal of fortune can be very swift and definitive. And most important, that if we're brave and we do our part, that everything will be okay for the Jews and for all people. Isn't that what Esther is telling us? As I said, Esther is a small book and a very big one. It reaches all the way back to the story of the Garden of Eden, as the Talmud points out. Haman's obsession with the one thing he can't have reminds us of Adam and Eve in the garden. And the story teaches us how everything that happened after that, and especially the diaspora, will bring us to the ultimate destination of history. In the light of all this, let's look at Purim as a holiday based on the allegorical book of Esther. We have two kinds of holidays, biblical and Talmudic. Of the biblical, all but one are mandated in the Torah. Only Purim comes from this little book in the writings, and not as God's commandment, but as Esther's. Torah holidays have two purposes, either to commemorate foundational historical events, Passover, for example, or to observe certain annual life cycle milestones like Sukkot, observing the harvest. Purim is different. It comes from a book that we've always seen more allegorical than historical. This suggests to me that unlike Passover, where we're celebrating an event that is clearly in the past, in Purim we're celebrating a future event, something that hasn't happened yet, that ultimate victory where the diaspora brings us to the Messianic era. Maybe this explains why we get drunk. Because if we're going to celebrate the redemption of the world, man, the world is pretty unredeemed. We're going to need to diminish our perception of reality for a while to help us imagine, for this one sweet day, that the world is redeemed, and celebrate. So I think that works. Finally, the allegory helps us to understand the kids, the costumes, the carnivals. Children are innocent. They don't understand the reality of the world, and they can believe without the help of alcohol that the world is a wonderful place. And especially when we as parents and as a caring community protect them from realities that can spoil that innocence, probably in the hope that when they do understand more, they will want to make the world better than it is. That protection is what a carnival represents. And that brings us to the overriding reason why this holiday is child-focused. As adults, we try to do our part, our tikkun olam, but we know that we may not live to see the Messianic age. But from deep within us, we hope and pray that our children will see it, and we try to guide and inspire them in that direction. That's my story of Purim as an allegory. I think we've done a lot to answer these questions, and I hope you'll respond to the challenge of going deeper into it and understanding how other details within the story may or may not work in this allegorical framework that I'm suggesting. This presentation is part one, which takes the story as an allegory about the world outside of us. There's a whole other way to look at it, as an allegory about the world within us. And I do invite you to enjoy that in part two.